Wilson had been thinking for a while, and after careful consideration, he firmly stated that he would not take the fall for House. He told House that he needed to learn to handle things on his own, even if it meant facing the world alone. Wilson believed this was the only way for House to grow, even if it meant their paths would no longer align. Hearing this, Wilson's ex-wife agreed, realizing that Wilson's kindness had allowed House to become reckless. Perhaps Wilson leaving would ultimately be good for House. House, taken aback by this, remained silent as his ex-wife continued, explaining that if House hadn't relied so heavily on Wilson, maybe his more compassionate side would have surfaced, and they wouldn't have ended their marriage. She reminded him that they would have had a child together if things had been different. House, now deeply reflective, admitted that he had destroyed every meaningful relationship he'd had. At that moment, House's ex-wife told him that he wasn't the only one who had loved him. As he looked around, he realized that Nika and the moments of happiness they once shared were also still a part of his life. But House dismissed this as nothing more than a fantasy. He believed nothing could undo the mistakes he'd made and lay back down on the floor, no longer responding to anyone. But just when House thought it was all over, a familiar figure appeared, Cameron. She wasn't there to comfort him, though. Instead, she bluntly told him that she wished he were dead, not as punishment, but as a release. House was confused by her words. Meanwhile, Wilson and a colleague were investigating the address they had found in a man's hospital records and arrived at a warehouse nearby. As they ran toward the growing smoke, they soon discovered the warehouse was engulfed in flames. House revealed that he had actually been given a chance to avoid jail, but he chose to reject it. This opportunity came when he was speaking to a patient, informing him of his terminal illness. The man, after a brief pause, had offered to take the fall for House, seeing no reason to continue living. He suggested that if House couldn't cure him, at least he could help him in this way. House was initially puzzled by the man's willingness, but later realized that the man felt he had nothing left to lose. Before House could falsify medical records to cover up the crime, he noticed the man's swollen neck and asked him if his willingness to help was because he was about to die. The man admitted that this was the reason. At that moment, Cameron appeared and told House that he had changed, that he wasn't selfishly hiding the truth about his patient's condition. House explained that he simply enjoyed solving mysteries. After some back and forth with Cameron, House admitted that he was capable of change. He decided to face reality and move forward. As he prepared to leave, Wilson and his colleagues spotted him near the warehouse, heading toward the entrance. But just as House was walking toward the door, the building collapsed, and Wilson rushed toward the wreckage in a panic, only to be held back by his colleague. The following morning, the fire department managed to put out the blaze, and everyone gathered outside, waiting for what they assumed would be bad news. Soon, a charred body was carried out, and it was confirmed that it was House. The news devastated everyone, especially Wilson, who had hoped for a different outcome. In the midst of his grief, Wilson began shouting at House, blaming him for everything. His emotions shifted from sadness to anger, but as Wilson ranted, a sudden phone ring interrupted him. Confused, he pulled out his phone, only to realize it wasn't his. After reading the message, Wilson immediately drove to House's house. When he arrived, he was shocked to find House alive. House explained that he had snuck out of the warehouse through the back door, returned to the hospital, and swapped his medical records to avoid the coroner's identification. Wilson was furious, unable to understand why House would do such a thing, especially knowing it would destroy his life. But House, calm and subdued, listened to Wilson's complaints without a word. Wilson eventually realized that House had done all this not to escape, but to spend the final months of his life with him. After House's departure, Chase officially took over House's department. Cameron, now married with children, occasionally thought back to the rebellious trio that once followed House. Foreman continued his work, but without the chaos House had caused, he felt an emptiness in his daily routine. One day, Foreman found House's old ID badge under the corner of a desk. Holding it, he suddenly wondered if House's death had been orchestrated. Meanwhile, House and Wilson, having reconciled, were preparing to begin their final journey together.